And by my clock, it is 10 o'clock. I'm sure we'll be getting more people joining in the audience, but I'd like to go ahead and kick off our session and welcome everyone here. I am Aideen Salehian, the Executive Director of the Peace Science Society International, and I'm very pleased to welcome everyone to what promises to be an outstanding roundtable on pandemics, politics, and peace. The Peace Science Society is an international network of scholars devoted to the scientific study of the causes of conflict and the promotion of peace. And every year we organize a program which is free and open to the public, in which scholars share their research and insights with a broader audience. Now, this year's session explores the intersection between public health, conflict, and peace building. And as we're all aware, the COVID-19 pandemic has affected nearly every aspect of our lives, from the way we work to education, travel, and commerce. And it's also clearly affected the dynamics of conflict. So our panel today will examine the impact of the pandemic and other public health emergencies on conflict trends. Before we begin, I'd like to announce that next week on Friday and Saturday, we'll be holding an academic conference with several outstanding papers on a variety of topics, ranging from civil unrest in the United States to international peace building, religious extremism, and more. The conference is only open to members of the Peace Science Society, however. So to browse the program and to become a member, please visit our website at peacescience.unt.edu. That's peacescience.unt.edu, and you'll also see that website on the flyer to this program. So I'd like to now introduce our moderator for this session, the president of the Peace Science Society, Professor Scott Gates. Professor Gates is research professor at the Peace Research Institute of Oslo and a professor at the University of Oslo. He was the director of PRIO Center for the Study of Civil War and has held positions at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, the University of Trondheim, and Michigan State University. He's one of the world's foremost experts on civil war and peace building, and he received his PhD from the University of Michigan. During our session, if you have any questions of our panelists, please use the Q&A function in Zoom. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Scott, who will introduce our panel and the format for today.
Thanks for the great introduction and a nice introduction to the panel. This year, we normally would be meeting in person, and we didn't even, I guess it's now been the second year in a row we haven't had a live conference for the Peace Science Society. But we'll take this opportunity, and maybe this session can reach a larger and broader audience. I'm really happy that the speaker lineup we have here, I think all of us are going to address the issues of pandemics, politics, and peace from a little bit different angle. And it should, I think, provide an interesting session. So we'll begin with Tanisha Fazal from the University of Minnesota. And then we'll go to Mansoob Murshed, who is at the Institute for Social Studies in The Hague, which is part of Erasmus University, and at the University of Coventry. And he's actually going to be speaking from the University of Coventry in a classroom. Sara Polo is from the University of Essex, and Wonjae Hwang is from the University of Tennessee. And we'll have Tanisha lead off with her thoughts. Thanks.
Okay, I just needed to unmute. Thank you so much, Adina and Scott, for organizing this session today. So what I want to talk about, just to kind of kick things off, is a question that I've been thinking a lot about, which is why there hasn't been more global cooperation around the COVID-19 pandemic, because you would think that if you were ever going to have a situation where you would have strong levels of global cooperation, it would be a situation like this one, where the pandemic, as Aideen said, is affecting everyone in the world and certainly every country in the world. And the lens that I want to use to think about this question of why it is that we haven't seen as much global cooperation as we might have thought is health diplomacy. And so in defining health diplomacy as international aid or cooperation that's meant to promote health and or that uses health programming to promote non-health related aims. So sometimes health diplomacy has a humanitarian aim, sometimes it has a more strategic aim, sometimes it's both. And health diplomacy occurs at multiple levels in the international system. It occurs at the global level, at the regional level, and at the bilateral level. And I want to go through all three. And the question that I want to think about in going through these three levels of health diplomacy is when states focus their energy is at which level. So in other words, when do they go global, when do they go regional, and when do they go bilateral when addressing a global health emergency like the COVID-19 pandemic? Let me start with the level of global health diplomacy. And in the context of the pandemic, another way of asking this question or angling this question is, why haven't we seen more action through the World Health Organization? Or you could flip that a little bit and ask, why didn't the World Health Organization, why hasn't it done a better job in terms of addressing the COVID-19 pandemic? And here my answer is that, I think a lot of, even though the WHO is the default, the organization we would all think of turning to in the context of a global pandemic, I think our expectations of the WHO were simply too high and unrealistic. Because the WHO, of course, is an intergovernmental organization. Its power comes from states. Its members are states. And while we would hope that it would do things like be able to monitor disease outbreaks in countries, and in fact, there is a set of international laws, the international health regulations that are sort of part and parcel of the way the WHO is supposed to work, that is supposed to mean that states do share data on disease outbreaks. But the fact is that the WHO doesn't have any enforcement capacity. So while it would have been very handy, of course, if states had shared information on disease outbreaks at the start of the pandemic, the WHO doesn't have a way of making states do that, nor does it have a way of punishing states for not doing that. And that is because states are going to be very reluctant to give an organization like the WHO the power to really look over their shoulder and gather sensitive information, like information about health in their country. And so for all these reasons, we don't have effective international institutions to address pandemics. This is not to say that the WHO is not a useful institution. It has a really very strong technical capability, and it does a lot outside of the context of pandemics. And even in the context of global health emergencies, it has often risen to the occasion. But typically, the WHO rises to the occasion when the health emergency is more geographically limited, less severe, and doesn't really implicate the interests of great powers directly, because those are the cases that the WHO can handle. All right, so if states don't go through the WHO, or if that's not where they're really concentrating their efforts, then what are some alternatives? Well, one alternative is to go to work at the regional level. And we've seen this happen a fair amount during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think one case where it's the regional dynamics have been especially interesting are in Africa. So the Africa CDC is a relatively new organization, and it's actually done quite well in addressing the pandemic at a regional level. Another institution that we've seen stood up in Africa is the African Vaccine Acquisition Facility, or AVAT, which is, it's interesting to compare AVAT, which is meant to negotiate vaccine purchases for African countries. It's interesting to compare AVAT with COVAX, which is at the level of global health diplomacy, and is, of course, the vaccine facility that has been stood up by the World Health Organization as well as other organizations. The advantage for African countries of AVAT is that it gives them more leverage. And in particular, African countries, at the time that AVAT was created specifically, were very interested in the Johnson & Johnson vaccine because it was a one-shot vaccine that didn't require cold storage the way that, say, the mRNA vaccines do. And so they wanted to be able to choose the vaccine that they were going to get, and they were concerned that they might not have that choice if they went exclusively through COVAX. So we do see a lot of regional diplomacy in general, and certainly in the context of the pandemic. The third type of health diplomacy that I want to talk about is bilateral health diplomacy. Now, a lot of health diplomacy is bilateral, again, even outside the context of health emergencies like pandemics. What I want to suggest, though, is that health diplomacy has become a new arena of great power competition. And we see this especially in the relationship between US and Chinese health diplomacy. I'm going to hit play on this map in just a moment. And I should mention that this is based on research that I've been doing with a student of mine at the University of Minnesota, Logan Stundle. And what this map is going to show you is which countries are receiving health aid from the US, from China, or both. So if they're receiving health aid from the US, they're in blue, which is what you see most of the world is happening in most of the world in 2001. From China, it'll be red, and from both is purple. And what's interesting to me is that over time, the US and China have converged over time in terms of where they're delivering health aid. So the US and China are responding to each other. They're making sure that if one country is delivering health aid to a particular country, then they're there too. And certainly in the context of COVID-19, we have seen a lot of bilateral health diplomacy. We've seen a lot of mask diplomacy, and more recently, a lot of vaccine diplomacy. And here I think it's especially interesting to think about the role of Chinese vaccines and vaccine diplomacy. So earlier this year, as vaccines were rolling out, and we were seeing really promising data from, for example, the mRNA vaccines from Pfizer and Moderna, most of the world was not able to access these really effective vaccines. Instead, the vaccines that were on offer to most of the world were Chinese vaccines. And China was certainly playing politics in terms of vaccine diplomacy, for example, in only agreeing to sell or donate vaccines to specific countries if they would cut relations with Taiwan. But I think in some ways, the bigger issue has to do with the fact that most of the world that has received vaccines has received these Chinese vaccines, and they're much less effective than the mRNA vaccines, than the AstraZeneca vaccine. And so when we talk and think about the quantity of the world, the amount of the world that's been vaccinated, I think we also need to think about the quality of these vaccines, because the fact that most of the world has received the Chinese vaccines means that the pandemic is going to last longer than it would have otherwise. Now, this is, of course, not just the responsibility of the Chinese. It is also, countries like the United States and the United Kingdom, as well as corporations like Pfizer and Moderna, that bear a lot of responsibility for the way in which these vaccines have been distributed. And that the vaccine diplomacy aspect of this, I think, shows some of the inefficiencies of both bilateral health diplomacy and global health diplomacy today, really underlining the scope of the problem. All right, so let me wrap up by thinking about what happens next in terms of health diplomacy. I mean, I think we're going to see an increasingly heterogeneous global health landscape. The WHO will continue to face sovereignty challenges in dealing with the sovereignty constraints that it faces as an international governmental organization. This isn't going to go away, especially with countries like China, which is very jealous of its sovereignty on the rise. But I also don't think that the WHO is going anywhere. I do think that one additional challenge to the WHO has to do with the fact that so much of its funding comes from private foundations like the Gates Foundation today. And so it may have to rethink some of its membership structure. I think that we'll probably see more in the way of regional health diplomacy, which can be beneficial, especially for poorer countries, because it gives them more purchasing leverage. It allows them to create travel bubbles. So it allows them to have some containment after a while. We've seen this in the context of the pandemic, and it builds on and helps smooth existing local relationships. But we're more likely to see this emerge in some parts of the world than others. And I think that we'll continue to see a lot of bilateral health diplomacy. I suspect that in the near to medium term, health is going to become more central to foreign policy. And I think, frankly, that these trends bode ill because we know that pandemics are going to become more frequent. And so while we'll go into the next pandemic with more experience, I'm not particularly optimistic about how successful we'll be in addressing it. I'm going to stop there on that pessimistic note and kick it back to Scott.
Thank you. Thank you very much. What we're going to do now is we'll turn to Mansoob Murshed, who'll give also a brief presentation. After all the presentations, we'll get into a discussion. Mansoob.
Thank you very much, Scott. I trust you can see my PowerPoint.
Yes. Yep.
Actually, my talk is based upon a paper co-authored by me and 4 other individuals, and Scott is one of them. I'm very happy to be able to give this talk to this audience. This is perhaps one of the largest audiences we've given this paper to. So the paper is entitled, Populism and the COVID-19 Pandemic, and how that's sort of managed or mismanaged by populist governments. So I think it's probably right to say something about populism as a political force which seems to be on the rise everywhere in the world, both in the developed, industrialized, richer parts of the world, as well as in the developing world, particularly middle-income countries, countries which are in between rich and poor countries. So basically, populists are defined as, politicians who represent the will of the people, whatever that is, because that's a particularly vague term. And the other thing which I personally like to emphasize very much is that many of these populist politicians are not just populists, but they are plutocrats. And they combine their plutocratic intentions with nationalistic rhetoric in order to win support. And in the background, you have this hugely immiserized population because of rising global inequality and sort of linguistic or religious nationalism in certain parts of the world, like India, as well as the decline of the former unskilled manufacturing workforce, their immiserization in countries like the United States, the United Kingdom, and elsewhere in the industrialized world, because of the loss of jobs in the manufacturing sector and basically the immiserization of the bottom 40% of the income distribution, to the extent to which even the household who's a medium in the middle household, they too have become immiserized, impoverished in recent years because of the changes to the distribution of income. And in other parts of the world, like in India, they provide a kind of nationalistic demand. Okay. Now, the next question is, why do we want to link this to the COVID-19 pandemic? There's been some literature trying to address the difference between democratic and autocratic nations. The idea was that China managed, or at least seemed to have managed, the the COVID-19 pandemic rather well, at least in the beginning, and maybe even now. And China is an autocratic state, and other democracies did not appear to do so. So that was motivation for studies which compared autocratic and democratic country government responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. But what is missing in this literature is to look at populist governments. And let me remind you, ladies and gentlemen, that populist states are not the same thing as an autocratic state. So, for example, an established kind of one-party dictatorship is not a populist. Okay, so China is not a populist, nor is traditionally Russia populist. It's autocratic. Okay, so essentially there is this lacunae in the literature. So what do we do? Let me just basically start out by giving you a kind of a little verbal sketch of the theoretical model, which is a game theoretical model, where, you know, there is a political system, there's an electoral system, and then you have certain types of individuals who are predisposed to vote for a populist politician. This person is an immerserized worker who probably worked in the manufacturing sector and is now displaced from their previous job and is finding it difficult to make ends meet. And they hark back to an earlier age when things were better for them. And they subscribe to the nationalistic, rhetoric of the populist politician, for example, Donald Trump in the United States. And they too, and essentially they're predisposed. It means that, you know, they don't have to be told the truth. They just have to be told something which they will believe in. They will believe the populist rhetoric, the populist memes which come out of social media, and then buy it because they're predisposed. So we use a little bit of something called prospect theory to say that these people value the populist message, even if it makes them poor, because the populist leader may be actually quite a plutocratic individual. So then we go on to the supply of populism by two different politicians, and then we have an electoral outcome. But then we introduce strategic interaction between the government and the public once a pandemic has broken out. So this is the kind of apparatus which we use to describe strategic interaction between two groups. And here we have the context of the pandemic, number one. Number two, we have two stylized actors over here. One is the state or government and its policies, which are represented stylistically on the horizontal axis of the diagram. So it's a set of policies which we call G in abstract terms, but it includes things like lockdowns and other preventative measures which the state might undertake. Okay, and the other side is the general public. The general public can also exercise prudential measures, such as physical distancing. I personally dislike the term social distancing because we don't distance ourselves socially, but physically. 6 feet apart or 1.5 meters apart or 2 meters apart, and wear face masks. And those sorts of actions are captured by the stylized on the actions E, which are represented on the vertical axis of this diagram. And the two lines that you see there, ladies and gentlemen, are the reaction functions of the government to the actions of the public, and the reaction functions of the public to the actions of the state. So it's basically, there is a kind of strategic interdependence. What the government does depends upon what the public does, and what the public does depends upon what the government does. And where these two lines cross, we have a kind of Nash equilibrium. And the point is, when there is a pandemic, there's a shift from J to K, and this shift is shown to lead to increase in both prudential behavior from both the government side and the side of the public. But in populist-led states, this shift from J to K will be much smaller. That's what we postulate. And we postulate other things. Then we test some of this on actual data. So our hypotheses are the following. So populist states are averse to bringing in controls which will mitigate the pandemic. Things like lockdown, they're opposed to it. Secondly, we say that, you know, the efforts of the citizens and the public and the government are kind of, you know, jointly determined. There's strategic interaction between the two, which we captured in the previous diagram. But most importantly, we say that the outcomes, as far as the pandemic is concerned, in terms of mortality and other outcomes, infection rates, will be worse in populist governed countries, because populist governed countries care less about the pandemic and are averse to things like lockdowns, and where populists are elected, the citizens of those societies or states are less liable to exercise effort, preventative effort, you know, mask wearing, social, physical distancing, and so on. So, you know, our empirical design covers 42 countries for the year 2020. And of those, 11, something like 11 are populist, and most notably the United States, because the president of the United States in 2020 was Donald Trump, and he's regarded to be a populist. By the way, this definition of what constitutes a populist governed country is not our subjective definition, but we take it from a list of in the literature. We also have data on government responses, which we have to nuance a bit. We also have data on, you know, the behavior of the public, things like, you know, mobility, and we look at mortality. We focus not on the infection rate, but on excess mortality, the pandemic. And for this last purpose, we look at weekly data for the year 2020. In fact, we operate with weekly data. So basically, this little table with, you know, the negative signs on the first row, pretty statistically significant, shows you that, you know, the policy response is much worse in populist governed countries. So this populist government dummy is negative and highly significant. In other words, populists do not like to take measures against the pandemic. Then we have excess mortality. And here, the populist government dummy is positive and statistically highly significant. So more people die in populist government. And the list goes on as far as citizen mobility is concerned. And we do a variety of, you know, robustness checks and so on, which I will not bore you with those details. And I will just conclude there and pass on to the next speaker, and I'll be happy to take any questions if and when they arise. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mansoob. Let's turn now to Wonjae Hwang.
Thank you. Oh, I just lost my connections. I'm sorry. I have to.
Should we go to Sara and then you can have a little time?
I can go ahead now, but could you let me share the screen because I lost my connection before, so I don't. Okay, now I.
Yeah, you can share. You can go. You can share.
Sorry, the initial connection is very unstable in my place at school, so I lost about 10 minutes, but hopefully it won't happen again. All right.
So we can see it now.
Okay, thank you. All right. First of all, I want to thank Scott and Aideen for these valuable opportunities. This year, I have received a grant from Korea Foundation with some other scholars from Norway, South Korea, and the US. So under the title of Pandemics, Health Diplomacy, and Conflict, we have done some research this year. Although our findings are still preliminary, today I want to share some of our findings with you. In our project, there are two big themes. First, we try to examine the link between pandemics and conflict. Largely, there are two opposing claims on these issues, as you know. Some scholars argue that pandemics reduce conflict, facing a common threat from pandemics and call for ceasefire outside actors like UN. And also due to decreasing resources and opportunity to fight, parties in conflict may stop and lower their levels of fight. However, other scholars argue that pandemics actually promote conflict. As you know, pandemics have worsened economic and living conditions in many places, promoting people's incentive to engage in conflict and crime. Increasing violations of democratic standards have also unstabilized political system in many places. Also, increasing number of attacks on aid workers have also been reported recently. So all these indicators signals that pandemics may have negative effect on peace, but still we don't have concrete evidence on either of these claims. So we try to analyze the link by collecting more data and performing some analysis. The second thing is about the role of health diplomacy, particularly focusing on health aid in addressing challenges of pandemics. Health aid can be defined as international or aid or cooperation designed to promote health or non-health related goals. Basically, we try to examine what is the key driver of health aid and its allocations. To examine the link between COVID-19 and conflict, we have created this figure. In this figure, the x-axis indicates the number of deaths caused by armed conflict between 2020 and 2021, and the y-axis indicates the number of deaths caused by COVID-19. As you see, there is no clear statistically meaningful relationship between the two numbers. For example, Afghanistan and Yemen had a large number of armed conflict casualties, but they don't have many COVID-19 deaths. In contrast, Brazil and India have many COVID-19 casualties, but they did not lose too many conflict-related lives. So another important thing we can see in this figure is that COVID-19 generates serious negative effect on many countries' economy, which are much stronger than the effect conflict can generate on their economy. Most of the countries that significantly suffer from COVID-19, as you see in this figure, had negative economic growth rate in 2020, like India -8, Mexico in -8.2, and Peru -11 point. When we exclude some potential outlier from the figure, we still get the similar result, as you see in this figure. However, it doesn't necessarily mean that COVID-19 has nothing to do with conflict. Instead, this may mean that since there is big variations across countries, we need to examine the link more closely at various levels. In this regard, one of our teammates, Brandon Prince at University of Tennessee, has done research on the link between COVID-19 and piracy in West Africa and Indo-Pacific regions. According to his research, COVID-19 has promoted maritime piracy incidences in Nigeria, although he failed to find such evidence in Indo-Pacific regions. So he suggests that deteriorating economic conditions may have led people in Nigeria to actively engage in piracy during the COVID-19 period. As you know, pandemics has caused serious damage to many economies in developing world. Because of that, foreign aid is very essential for their responses to and recovery from pandemics. In this regard, how donor states allocate their health aid to others is very important topic to be explored. But generally, there has been a mismatch between health need and health aid in the past. As you see in this figure, DAH indicates development assistance for health, and DALY means disability adjusted life years, which is very important concept that has been promoted by World Health Organization and other international institutions as a measure of health conditions. Basically, DALY count total number of years lost due to health-related disabilities and deaths. And deaths just indicate the total number of deaths caused by health problem. As you see in this figure, there is a mismatch between DAH and DALY and deaths at the global level. And simply speaking, when there was a big need for help, a proper size of health aid was not.
Uh-oh. Well, I think we lost Wonjae Hwang.
I will go ahead and, well, he's gone now. Should we?
Yeah.
Oh, he's back. Should we try again?
Yeah, let's see.
I need to make Wonjae co-host again. There we go.
Welcome back.
Wonjae, you're muted.
Do you hear me?
Yes, now we do.
Sorry. I'm sorry. Okay, to get you a better idea what's going on in terms of health aid allocation, I create these figures to see whether donor states send foreign aid to mostly friendly states that have maintained similar foreign policy preferences with themselves. I create this figure. The x-axis indicates foreign aid preference differences between a donor and a recipient, and foreign policy preference differences are measured based on state voting behavior in the UN General Assembly. Here, 0 means that a recipient and donor vote always in the same way, like a US-Israel case. And a high number indicate donor and recipient vote quite differently in the UN General Assembly, like a US-China case. As you see in the left figure, when it comes to development aid, which exclude health aid, donors tend to send more and bigger size of aid to friendly state. However, interestingly, when it comes to health aid, which account for about 30% of total foreign aid these days, donors tend to send more and bigger size of aid to unfriendly states. This is a very old and interesting finding. So to get a better idea, to get a better idea, we perform a statistical analysis in which we control for some important relevant factors such as the size of health casualties, recipient GDP per capita, trade relations, and so on. As you see in this figure, we still find donors tend to send health aid to unfriendly or rival states. So we argue that based on this finding, this is
Oh, it's a very unstable connection.
Can you hear me?
Now I can.
So we argue that this is happening because donors utilize health aid as a partial tool to cultivate improve relationship with state with trouble relationship. So unlike other types of aid, health aid can be sent to an unfriendly or hostile state relatively easily and generate positive sentiment from recipients because health aid can be easily viewed as a humanitarian aid. So in this regard, health aid in comparison to other types of foreign aid or other policy tools such as economic sanctions can be very effective in buying minds and promoting donors' soft power in the recipient state. The previous analysis was based on data between 1990 and 2017. So then how about health aid for the COVID-19 and its allocations? In this, the following figure, which shows a health aid for COVID-19 from World Bank, we can see a positive relationship between health allocation and COVID-19 casualties. This is good news because this indicated multilateral health aid goes where it is most needed. India and Brazil, for example, have had many casualties due to COVID-19, and they have received big financial support from World Bank. But how about bilateral health aid? Unfortunately, we have not collected enough data to perform the analysis. Instead, we have examined the health aid allocation of the United States. As you see in the left figure, it seems that there is a positive relationship between health need and US health aid allocations. However, if we exclude India from the figure, we fail to find a statistically meaningful relationship between these two numbers. For example, although Ethiopia and Syria suffer from COVID-19 relatively less than others, they received a significant amount of health aid from the US. Their aid sizes are much bigger than those ones that went to India and Brazil. The right-hand side figure shows the relationship between foreign aid preference differences between US and a recipient and US health aid allocations. Here we find a weak but statistically meaningful positive relationship between them. The red symbol indicates member states in the UN Security Council. Scholars have argued that due to their political power, UN Security Council members tend to receive big benefit from others, but except India, we don't find any significant difference for this state from others. So all these figures imply that humanitarian purpose may not be the main driver of the US health aid for COVID-19. In a different study, other teammates from South Korea examined South Korea's health aid allocation during COVID-19 period. Basically, they argue that the South Korean government strategically choose their target of aid based upon their economic interest rather than the recipient health need. Their empirical findings confirm their argument. So overall, our findings so far give us a few tentative conclusions and implications. First, COVID-19 has promoted conflict and crime in some places. However, most studies necessary to find out the causal mechanism work in between these two links, and the link in between two factors. And second, health aid is not necessarily the main driver of health aid allocations. Rather, donor states' strategic interests may matter more. However, in terms of COVID-19 aid, mixed results are found, which again require a more sophisticated analysis. Finally, if you think if health aid is given to improve and cultivate a relationship with the historically troubled state for donors, in the long run, maybe health aid may promote international peace. So these are what we have found so far in our research. So I look forward to comment and questions during our discussion time. Thanks, and sorry for the disruptions of internet connections. And thank you.
Thank you very much. We managed, and you got through the presentation, so it's okay. All right, Sara Polo.
Okay, let's see.
Good, looks good.
Trying to see if I can. Okay, right. Great. Thank you, Scott, and thank you also to Aideen for organizing this event. So I study conflict and political violence, and so the way I approach the theme of this roundtable is from a focus on the effect of the COVID-19 pandemic on various types of conflicts around the world, and particularly the question of how the COVID-19 pandemic has affected patterns of political violence and protests, and how that in turn has affected prospects for peace. Now, as most of you know, back last year in March 2020, the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, called for a global ceasefire to focus all efforts on fighting the common enemy, namely the virus. And he also stated that the fury of the virus illustrates the folly of war. However, despite some initial optimism that the pandemic would in fact foster cooperation and create incentives for a humanitarian pause in conflict, violence and conflict around the world have continued to rage. And to quote a title from The Economist, the COVID-19 gave peace a chance, but nobody or almost nobody really took it. And so just by way of illustration, these two maps that I generated for an article that I published last year, they are based on data from the Armed Conflict Location and Events data set. And the map at the top shows the state of the world when it comes to armed conflict in 2019 before the pandemic. And then the other map shows the situation in the first 6 months of the pandemic in 2020. And one thing that appears here is that the world was already a violent conflict before the pandemic, but it remained so during the pandemic as well, at least in the first wave here, shown here. And when we sort of disaggregate these patterns temporally, and perhaps we compare them also with protests here are shown at the top, the first two charts, and then armed conflict at the bottom. And one thing that you can see here is that during the first wave of the pandemic, particularly the months of the lockdown, March and April, we saw a fairly sharp decline in protests and demonstration around the world. But there was no similar decline when we looked at armed conflict. Now, I will anticipate, though, as you may see already from the trends there in protests, that protests eventually picked up to the point that now that we have data for the whole of 2020, we can see that protests and demonstrations in the whole year have actually increased overall by about 7% compared to the previous year. Now, I spoke about having now data for 2020 so that we can better compare the first year of the pandemic with previous years. And so looking at the Uppsala Conflict Data Program that collects systematic data on organized violence around the world. In 2020, actually, organized violence increased relative to the previous year. We have seen more fatalities in this type of violence. And one trend that I found particularly concerning is that the declining trend in fatalities that we had been observing since about 2014, for the first time in 2020, actually broke upwards. And the UCDP also reports a record high number of state-based armed conflict in 2020. These are basically, for the most part, civil conflicts and interstate conflicts. ACLED paints a similar picture in the sense that political violence increased in more countries than it decreased. And in a lot of contexts, fire did not take place. In some contexts, they were very short-lived, but many actors were seemingly undeterred. And just to give you an example, Al-Shabaab in 2020, it escalated its violence by about 33% compared to the previous year. Violence against civilians and state repression based on ACLED and UCDP data also appear to have increased in 2020 relative to the previous year. And this both in terms of the number of actors as well as the number of killings. And another form of violence that has increased is a non-state conflict and particularly communal violence. Here you can see in the top panel is data on communal conflict, ethnic, religious, and tribal from ACLED. And again, the first wave of the pandemic, you can see an increase in this type of violence as well. And not only that, but throughout the pandemic, we have observed a fairly large number of COVID-19 related disorders. These are really specific to COVID-19 issues, responses, restrictions, and so on. But what I found particularly interesting is that a lot of these disorders have taken place in countries that don't have an ongoing sort of armed conflict or an ongoing civil war, for example. So they have spread to other countries as well. And so the obvious question at this point is, what could explain these patterns and sort of why conflict has not decreased? And here I want to focus on sort of two sets of mechanisms and explanations that might underlie these patterns, and leveraging the sort of the grievances and opportunities framework that is quite popular in the conflict literature, and looking at sort of how the pandemic and particularly responses to the pandemic have affected factors that are conducive to conflict. And so I'll start with grievances. As we all know, that the pandemic has been a major source of economic grievances. It has brought about perhaps the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. It has created record high levels of unemployment, acute resource scarcities, food insecurities, and particularly these, the latter have been felt in countries that in contexts that are already quite vulnerable. For example, in Africa, Africa is also the region of the world that has seen the largest conflict escalation. Africa, we know, is a net food importer. But besides that, one major source of grievances in the context of this pandemic had to deal with government responses to the pandemic itself. Governments have imposed various restrictions to the freedoms that citizens normally enjoy, for example, lockdowns and quarantines. But one aspect that has been particularly concerning, especially in certain contexts, has been the violent enforcement of these COVID containment measures. So, for example, the police has been at the center of a lot of these responses, and it was not infrequent to see the police using lethal violence, for example, in Nigeria, in Uganda, in Iraq, to basically against the protesters, people that were protesting against the COVID-related restrictions. So, for example, in March 2020, Uganda experienced probably the largest violent unrest in a decade. And that was precisely as a result of the police forces using violence on protesters. In the DRC, there were two conflicts that had been inactive for several years that in 2020 became active precisely because of government violent responses to demonstrations from the Bunduria Congo and Katsakatanga movements. And another aspect that I want to highlight is the fact that the pandemic not only has sort of worsened the relationship between government and citizens in many countries, but also has strained intergroup relations. And one phenomenon in particular, which is not unique to this pandemic, though, is the violent scapegoating of out groups. So, for example, minorities, immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers that were incorrectly blamed for introducing and spreading the virus. Now, interestingly, not only scapegoating is not a new phenomenon, but the fact that it takes violent forms has been observed, particularly when people face sort of existential threats, like threats to life. And the disease, COVID, is one, but I work on terrorism, on other things, and we have seen that in the context of terrorism and in the refugee crisis as well, where refugees were blamed for importing terrorism. But the pandemic has also been a source of political opportunities. And by political opportunities, I mean sort of structural or organizational changes that affect, for example, the expected cost of political action or mobilization, as well as the perceived chances of success. And here I want to focus first on rebel groups and governments, and on how the pandemic has essentially reduced the monitoring and sanctioning capacity of many states, especially states that were already characterized by lower state capacity. So, for example, the police and the army have been used as first responders, as also to enforce a lot of COVID containment measures. And besides exposing these to the disease, these tasks have increased pressure on these forces and strained their capacity. Governments also often had to divert resources away from fighting rebel groups and toward fighting the pandemic. And this was an opportunity for many rebel organizations to step up violence. And I give you one example of Al-Qaeda affiliate in Mali that sort of publicly welcomed COVID-19 as a God-sent soldier because it weakened the Malian government. But there is another very interesting phenomena that we have observed also in the context of the pandemic, and it's rebels engaging in what has been called competitive governance. So basically rebel groups trying to win over support of the population, trying to prove themselves as better governing actors and particularly when the government responses to the pandemic had generated a lot of dissatisfaction or were perceived as inadequate or incompetent. And so, for example, groups like the Taliban have created sort of quarantine centers. They've enforced lockdowns or policed curfews and provided personal protective equipment to the population. Now, the pandemic has also provided opportunities to governments in a different way, though. And what I want to focus here is on how essentially the situation of the state of emergency brought about by the pandemic has effectively provided cover for certain regimes around the world to repress the opposition, to stifle dissent and silence their critics. So effectively, the emergency gave some governments a license to repress, and these governments engage in forms of what has been called opportunistic repression. Now, the VDEM Institute has called this very aptly, in my view, a pandemic backsliding, echoing the better known, I guess, democratic backsliding. So this idea that there is a progressive erosion or outright violation of democratic norms and democratic standards in many regimes. And I find this pandemic backsliding to be concerning not only in its own because of how it affects democratic standards and how it affects the lives of people, but also because we know that repression can fuel sort of reactive mobilization, and therefore it can generate cycles of violence. Now, these are obviously just some mechanism. I wanted to emphasize this because I find them particularly important. And with this, I will conclude, and I look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you very much. So as a kind of means of summarizing, we have one optimist, Wonjae, and three rather pessimistic presentations. Sarah's presentation overlaps quite a bit with Mansoob's, especially with regard to democratic backsliding and the aspects of what she was looking at. Also, the othering or the scapegoating seems to be fitting nicely with notions of populist leaders manipulating symbols, or what Mansoob referred to as memes. Wonjae's paper and Tanisha's come in conflict with one another. I guess it's a bit on how one wants to interpret things and what type of orientation one wants to put upon them. And then I guess to some extent Sarah's and Wonjae's have some different perspectives on the levels of conflict and the prospects for peace. That's kind of a very short summary. We don't have so much time, and what I thought is I would kind of shift the direction here a little bit, rather than focus on our optimism or our pessimism, but to ask a question of everyone, and that is the UNDP's 2022 Human Development Report is going to be entitled Transitions Under Uncertainty. And one thing that the pandemic has brought is a considerable degree of uncertainty about a lot of things. And I guess what I would like each of the panelists to reflect is what's the primary uncertainty that's facing the world right now with regards to the link between the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, the political reaction to that, and then the prospects for peace. So what uncertainties are we facing, and how can we get around those uncertainties and transition towards more peaceful rather than a more violent response? Anybody want to jump in, or should I just call on you in the order that you presented? Anybody want to jump on that one?
May I?
Okay, Mansoob.
Yeah, It's just that, historically, pandemics have been the harbinger of really big systemic changes, right? So, for example, the 14th century Black Death, began the process by which feudalism in Western Europe and even Southern Europe started unraveling, more slowly in Southern Europe and more quickly in Western Europe. So I think because I'm an economist, really the big uncertainty, what is it going to do in terms of employment, in terms of the distribution of income? So is that this trend of rising inequality, will that continue, and for how long will it continue? Will there be a reversal of that process? For example, again, after the Black Death, there was a temporary, equalization effect, because those who survived could claim higher wages and even blackmail the landlord. Okay, but that didn't last too long, about a century. And so those are the distribution of income and the nature of work. So we are hearing stories about people withdrawing labor and exiting the labor force.
Yeah.
So to me, that's sort of a big issue.
Seems to me too is that the uncertainty is easily preyed upon by populist politicians, that they can take that uncertainty and vulnerability and capitalize on it. Anybody else want to jump in on this question? Yeah, Tanisha.
I just wanted, as a procedural thing, Scott, I just wanted to mention there are some questions in the Q&A also that we should get to.
Okay, yeah, I will. I'll do that.
To your question, the way that I think about this, and this speaks to also Mansoob's answer, is so just zooming back, I think that as an international relations scholar, not as an economist, there are three big questions around the international relations of COVID-19. One is, why have some countries done better than others? Which some of our speakers today have addressed that. Another is why we haven't seen more global cooperation in the face of the pandemic. And the third is whether COVID-19 is going to change international relations going forward. And I think your question really speaks to this third question in particular. My own take is that COVID-19 is unlikely to really upend things in terms of the direction of international relations going forward, existing trends. I think it's more likely to accelerate or exacerbate existing trends. And for me, the way that uncertainty comes in and the way that relates to uncertainty is actually in connecting this to this question of global cooperation. Because I think the bigger issue, even though this is a panel about pandemics, is actually climate change. That's really the existential crisis of our time. And I'm very worried that if we can't get it together when it comes to a worldwide pandemic, then the odds are not looking very good when it comes to dealing with climate change.
It actually is the major theme for the Human Development Report from UNDP, will be the uncertainty relating, but there are aspects that I thought I would transfer to our discussion here about the pandemic. Sara or Wonjae, do you want to add something? Yeah, Wonjae.
Yeah, I want to say small uncertainty and a big uncertainty. In terms of small uncertainty, which is about health aid effectiveness. So we try to address all these issues, disaster crisis around the world by, internationally, to reaching out these people and helping them out. But first, health aid allocation is one of the issues, and type of aid we are offering could be another issue. Like for example, in Peru, 70% of the people are working in informal sectors. So just giving money to the government is not enough to address those issues. So there are a lot of the different structure, economic, social structure in many different places in the world. So maybe what we need is not just giving money, but in the long run, we need to work with them to restructure the healthcare system and economic systems. So this is uncertainty we are facing small in terms of economic, the health aid effectiveness. The second one is clear, similar to the Nisha mentioned, which is about the impact of pandemic or COVID-19 its impact on international relations, world politics. We all know that, as Scott said you said that all pessimistic. I'm optimistic about the future of the international politics, but I share the similar concerns. I know the numbers. The democratic backsliding is happening. The number of violations, the democratic standard is occurring. The number of conflicts rising. What I'm just saying that still we don't see. One of the questions is that maybe there is underreporting bias. Yeah, that's true. So although there is no clear positive correlations between conflict and the COVID-19 deaths, maybe because they are not reporting enough. But if you just trust the numbers, then we still find clear evidence. But still, I'm not saying that number of conflict has declined. It's increasing, and also in terms of different types of conflicts rising. However, I'm not quite sure what kind of things. I mean, this disaster, like rising conflict, rising the violations, democratic value in many places, and how it will reshape the world politics in the future. Because crisis has always created opportunity for some states who prepare to take advantage from the crisis. That's why I'm saying that. That's why I'm optimistic about. I mean, I want to be optimistic about the future. This crisis can create opportunity to many countries like the US, because health aid, our effort to help other countries can be very effective in changing relationship among countries because of the trouble and crisis we are facing. So we are pessimistic, but we try to be optimistic. If you're smart and we try to focus on their need, humanitarian purpose, and reaching out to these people and divide our plan very wisely, maybe we have better chance to create a better world in terms of managing international peace. There's uncertainty, but I want to be optimistic about the uncertainty about international relations in the future.
All right, thank you. Sara.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. Yeah, just very briefly. So as somebody who studies conflict, so for me, a great question is sort of what is the future trajectories of these conflicts, old and new, and to tie into the role of international cooperation that was brought about earlier. A lot of conflicts don't end by themselves, especially if you're trying to get the parties to the negotiating table and to get peace agreements to last. Right? You need third-party enforcers, and that calls into question the role, for example, of the United Nations, but also powerful countries. And then we see a lot of sort of national retrenchment when it comes to a lot of major powers. And so for me, this is sort of, will the international community, the UN, rise to the challenge that we're seeing? Sort of what role will they play in these conflicts in the future? Because unless you wait for somebody to win, and that also creates problems of their own, if you want to get the parties to the negotiating table, oftentimes warring actors by themselves are not willing to do that.
Yeah, I guess that's where Tanisha's comments about differentiating regional and success in regional affairs rather than at the global level, that there may be room for optimism in that regard, because especially with the interesting story about Africa and the vaccination politics, that was quite interesting in regard to also trying to think about how addressing peace or conflict situations could be handled at a regional level rather than at a global level. I think this is a good time. Wonjae actually started to address one of the questions, but I thought we could more address it. So this was, can the lack of correlation between COVID-19 deaths and conflict be because of underreporting? Does anybody want to handle that one? Well, yeah, okay. Go ahead.
I think the question come from my figure that I presented. So I think, again, I have to answer to the questions, although I already mentioned briefly. Yes, that's a very good point. So the number of incidents we have now talking about today is based on some collection from like the event data analysis, which is also based on mass media report. But in some country like, I'm sorry to say, China, So where the mass media is severely under control by the government supervisions, we may not be collecting clear numbers of casualty from those countries. So yeah, there is under-reporting bias. But at the same time, also it may happen in some countries like China, when especially if the country has enough resources to address those challenges they're facing from the COVID-19. But this is best strategy for the countries don't have enough resources to address these issues because they need help from outside world. So just underreporting the number of cases or deaths actually is not a good idea for this country. So yes, this is fundamental issue for the researchers. There is always underreporting bias. So, but in a way we have to address it. And thank you for the point. Yeah, that's a very good point. It is happening in some countries. If you especially look at China, the number of deaths is pretty small, which is very strange.
Yeah, in this regard, Mansoob's presentation focusing on excess mortality with regards to the nature and severity of the pandemic helps address that problem, but it's much more difficult. You can't use excess mortality really to understand battle deaths per se. It's quite difficult, and it's going to, I guess, the number of casualties is going to be prone to manipulation, to exaggerate the numbers if it's politically if it's politically advantageous, or to undercount them depending on how the leaders would, if they're able to do that. And I guess there's always biases about where the conflict is occurring and how much media attention there is in that place. I think we'll go to the second question. And this is actually aimed at Nisha from Emily Ritter. And it's the convergence of health aid from the US and from China is fascinating. Do you have a sense if this is competition for control or influence in the recipient state, or is it signaling between the two major powers?
So thanks, Emily, for the question. Actually, before I answer it, I just wanted to just say one thing.
Oh yeah, fine, do that. Yeah, that's good, because then we get this interchange between us.
To add on to Wonjae's, the question to Wonjae about underreporting, I would, I'll put it in the chat in a moment, but I would really recommend Catherine Worsnup's work here, which she's done work on health data reporting. And one of the things she finds, if I'm remembering correctly, is that state capacity matters a great deal. And we know that the countries that are involved in civil conflicts tend to have low state capacity. And so these countries are already underreporting just because of their low state capacity, and we would expect that to continue in the context of conflict where it's very difficult to get health data. So I like Scott's suggestion for you of looking at excess mortality based on Mansoob's work. But to Emily's really excellent question. So I think that this really is a competition that's going on with respect or between the United States and China for sort of soft power in these various countries around the world. And I want to reiterate that this is a paper that I'm working on with a student of mine, Logan Stendhal, who does really terrific work on conflict and health, actually. So what we find is similar to actually Wonjae's analysis. We find that health need is not a predictor of which countries are getting health aid, but instead really the best predictor, or a very strong predictor, is whether the other country, right? So if you're China, is the US delivering health aid, and vice versa. But I also think that the US and China are not necessarily playing the same game when it comes to bilateral health aid. I think the US is engaged in a kind of knee-jerk competition, whereas the delivery and distribution of Chinese health aid is a little bit more, there might be a little bit more thought and systematization around it, behind it, because it's really tracking the Belt and Road Initiative. And the US doesn't really have an analog to that. But there are a couple of interesting dynamics that I just wanted to mention, which is that when you just look at militarized health aid, the map looks quite different. The US and China aren't necessarily operating in the same countries, but they're often operating in adjacent countries. So they're nearby, but they're not directly stepping on each other's toes. And what the secondary literature is telling us, we haven't done this analysis ourselves, but there's a secondary literature on public opinion in receiving countries, the countries that are receiving health aid. And public opinion toward Chinese health aid is quite different to public opinion to receiving US health aid. If the US is sending aid, then it tends to actually have a positive effect on US public opinion. But if China is sending aid, health aid, it oftentimes leads to a negative effect on public opinion. And part of the reason for this is that the Chinese health aid is often viewed as substandard, as shoddy. And it may also be the case that to the extent that the BRI is really a jobs program for Chinese nationals, this health aid isn't really helping the local community in a way that you might expect, or that US health aid is.
Quite interesting. It also relates to what Wonjae was talking about, and that is the general lack of relationship between development assistance and health assistance. There were a series of papers in the early 2000s on the distribution patterns of aid, one by Alessina and Dollar, and then Dollar and Burnside. And they were finding that the US gave for its security reasons, and Britain and France gave to their ex-colonial, their ex-colonies, and you see that. But my guess is that that pattern isn't borne out with health assistance. We're not going to see the same pattern. And I do think it's quite interesting looking at the UN votes and the correlation there in the distribution of health assistance. I don't believe that was part of either of the Alessina and Dollar or the Burnside and Dollar analysis, though. Anyways, just a little aside on aid. I want to raise, there's one more question, a fairly long one. So I'm going to read it for everybody. Thank you for your presentations. And while it seems that we have a major collective action problem when it comes to global cooperation, there seems to be some evidence that smaller groups may be better able to coordinate their efforts towards the pandemic, even rebels, as Sara mentioned, and gangs, as noted in the media. Is the trajectory of cooperation less global and more subnational, or even smaller? And if yes, how do we reconcile this with the spike in communal conflicts? And then she apologizes for the long question, but I think it's quite a good question. Anybody want to handle that one? Why don't you take that, Nisha, because that kind of centrally relates to your initial presentation.
Well, I think Sara unmuted herself, so maybe she should go first.
No, go ahead. Please go ahead. I'll follow.
Well, I mean, so what I would say is I actually see some really interesting subnational dynamics, not necessarily, I mean, I think it is very interesting to look at this at the level of rebels, but I'm going to let Sara speak to that. What I've seen, or what I've observed in the context of COVID, and also honestly to some extent in the context of climate change, is subnational units like states in the United States engaging in independent foreign policy in order to deal with this health emergency. And that, I think, is a really fascinating dynamic that, you know, kind of violates sovereignty norms in some interesting ways, but is not really something that we have a handle on. But it speaks, and I'll go on a limb here, and I'll quote Alessina again, Scott, and say that, you know, in some of his other work with Spolare, was on state size. And so, you know, one of the things that I've been wondering is whether, you know, this literature that we have on state size, optimal state size, which speaks to economies and national defense, could be applied to the context of pandemics. And maybe some of our, you know, large federal countries in the world are actually not optimally sized for dealing with pandemics.
Interesting. Sara.
Yeah, thanks so much, Liana, for the question. You know, I would make a distinction also between intra-group cooperation and intergroup cooperation, because a lot of the cases that I looked at tended to be sort of cooperation within the same, for example, ethnic group, right? Or a rebel organization that is sort of catering to communities that they're already trying to appeal to also on identity basis. So how to foster sort of intergroup cooperation from the perspective of like non-state actors, that might be more challenging. And I think part of the reason is also because on the one hand, if you look at communal conflicts, one of the factors, among others, that has been associated with communal conflict has to do with competition for resources, right? And thinking about all of the resource scarcities that the pandemic, food insecurity that the pandemic has introduced, right? You become more inward looking and you think for your group as opposed to sharing with others. I read also that, speaking about sort of interesting cooperation patterns, that in the United States, because of all of the protests about the COVID-related restrictions, various sort of right-wing movements and individuals with right-wing sympathies were able basically to gather together and become part of a network. So that was an interesting case of maybe unintended effect of the pandemics fostering cooperation among these actors.
Mansoob, do you have any thoughts about collective action and cooperation and maybe subnational cooperation?
No, except, to repeat what Perito and even Mansoob Olsen said about collective action. That collective action depends, that's Olsen, on the circumstance and what gels people together. And Perito's assertion that collective action among the few is much easier than among the many. So, it's like millions of people hurt by something. It's harder for them to undertake collective action unless it's an existential threat. So I think, collective action amongst, right-wing groups, the alt-right, as you say, in the United States, anti-vaxxers, is more likely under these circumstances because they're small. And that's the kind of collective action which has been taking place. There have been reported incidents in smaller communities of also the right type of preventative COVID-19 preventative collective action taking place in localized communities at the level of the municipality, the parish, the street, the village, and so on. So there are all sorts of examples, and we need a systematic study to look at it.
Yeah, thanks. Wonjae, have some. You're muted.
Yeah, I don't have much information about small group coordinations about the COVID-19 or pandemic, the aid. But I just want to highlight that the health aid has been effective and more freely given to other countries because the aid, the way the send is through not the government in many cases. This is called bypass aid. So aid has not been transferred, health aid especially has not been transferred, not necessarily between government to government, but mostly like multinational institutions or through some domestic interest group. So I guess it's not only the small group coordination is important, but it's international non-state actor coordination is really important in addressing these pandemic challenges and promoting peace in those countries. I just want to highlight that health aid in that sense also different from other types of aid in terms of the type of the way of the aid is transferred to others.
Thank you. I'm going to go one step beyond on this question. Or no, Aidean, do you have a question you want to come in here?
I do, and I'm going to use executive director's prerogative here. Even though I'm supposed to be in the background and just managing the meeting, I actually had a question for Nisha and Mansoob, because I think there's something about your two presentations that is worth exploring, and that is, as Mansoob noted, the United States was run by a populist government at the beginning of this pandemic. And prior to the pandemic, we all know the concerns about misinformation and distrust of elites, and that includes academics and scientists. So the world's largest power had a populist government. So thinking about Nisha and the room for global cooperation, is do we think that the trajectory of the pandemic would have been different from the perspective of international cooperation and scientific consensus and aid and so on, if a different president was in power in the United States?
Should I take that?
Yeah, please.
Okay, so I mean, this is quite the counterfactual, right? Because a lot of things would potentially have to change. So I think to think about that question, we could think about it in terms of what would happen domestically in the United States and what would happen globally. I'm not sure things would have changed that much domestically because the US, had Clinton won instead of Trump, I think the US would have still been quite polarized. Internationally, I think that we probably, the US would not have withdrawn from the WHO, right? For example. So I think that I'm not sure you would see that much of a difference in terms of global cooperation, because I do think that, I'm sort of enough of a cynic to think that the incentives of the pandemic are such that the responses nationally were really quite similar to what happened in 1918, right? With respect to closing borders, because there was so much uncertainty about what was happening. I think you might have seen more in the way of sort of better instruments for vaccine distribution earlier, but I'm not sure that they would have been that much better. I think that the biggest difference might be in sort of the looking forward sense, assuming, just playing out your counterfactual idea in a second Clinton term, for example. I don't think that you would have the same kind of anxiety that we see today, or not at the same level, about the liberal international order, the future of the liberal international order, the so-called liberal international order. Because I think a lot of that anxiety stems from the fact that, the US was really a leading player in the liberal international order historically. And the part of the problem now is that if Trump happened once, then that could happen again. And in fact, quite possibly could happen again, especially if he runs for president in 2024. So I think that the future prospects for global cooperation might be better had things turned out differently in 2016, but I'm not sure. I think we might have seen improvements at the margins with respect to addressing the pandemic globally, but I'm not so sure that it really would have made a significant difference.
Mansoob, do you have some reflections?
I tend to agree with Nisha up to a point. I was just simply thinking of the global financial crisis, which unleashed itself in 2008. And in 2010, there was a global summit, albeit not completely led by the United States, but the United States and the United Kingdom getting together with the type of government which was then in place in both the countries. So I think not only did we have a populist or like Donald Trump, but we also had a populist in the United Kingdom in the shape of Boris Johnson. So otherwise there would have been a global summit to tackle, in my opinion, that's my sort of guess, to tackle the pandemic, including measures, especially manufactured distribution of vaccines. And although some of it would end up, as it inevitably is in cheap talk in terms of vaccine distribution through the COVAX facility, I think it would have worked better. And the measures and the science would be more shared, and we would, approach a plateau in terms of the pandemic. That's my take.
Thank you. I guess we only have 2 minutes, right, Aidian? So I'm going to give Sara and Wonjae a chance just to make a final little comment, either on the subject of a counterfactual, or if there's something that you would like to add to the discussion that we didn't add. Sara?
Yeah, just two things. One thing on the kind of factor, just to say that I agree with Tanisha and also with Mansoob about the improvement only on the margin. And I just wanted to give the example of after the UN Secretary General made the call, there was a resolution on the table of the UN Security Council that didn't pass. It would have helped to give momentum to that call, because there were some rebel groups and government that actually responded positively, but the resolution didn't pass, and it didn't pass for like over 3 months because Donald Trump complained about the reference to the WHO, and he disagreed with that. But even when eventually, that resolution was passed unanimously, unfortunately, ceasefire still didn't happen, despite, the support of the UN Security Council. So I just wanted to.
Yeah, good example. Thanks. Wonjae, last word.
Okay. My report, my presentation it just shows that there is no clear connection between COVID-19 casualties and conflict casualties. So what I wanted to say based on the finding is that we obviously want to say something about the negative effect of pandemic can cause to international peace and conflict. But maybe we are missing some important factor there. What actually driving the rising conflict or rising number of pandemic casualty is not, maybe something else like economic issue, economic structures. So I want to draw more attention to these more fundamental thought factors driving the rising number of protests and conflict and the deaths, COVID, which is more economic situations and economic trouble many countries facing. So in that sense, again, foreign aid allocation is pretty important to address all these issues. So we cannot just say the pandemic is the main cause of the rising casualties and the arms conflict. This is too simplest to me. We need to look at more fundamental causes of these rising conflict and violations of the democratic values. And in that sense, as we all discussed, the leadership matter, especially in the US. What kind of leaders we have matter, because US, the most powerful country in the world, we are leading the multilateral institution like World Bank and IMF, and also bilateral. We have spent like more than $19 billion so far for foreign aid, which is one of the biggest in the world. And then, as you see, it's interestingly, for example, like Syria or Ethiopia, we have imposed sanctions in the past, try to correct this malpractice in the human rights issues and all these things. But all of a sudden, now Joe Biden administration, we send more than $200 million to Syria. This is against our idea of the imposing sanctions and tying their hands. So maybe there's something going on there in their minds, and maybe they might have a creative idea how to cultivate and improve relationship with some of the countries we have had trouble in the past. So definitely, what kind of leaders have matter, especially in the US.
Thanks a lot. We're over time. I very much appreciate, we could have kept on going for a lot longer. I have many questions that we never got to. We didn't even talk about COVAX or anything, but really, really interesting presentations. Nice overview. Thanks, Aidian, for helping organize this. Thanks for every one of you guys. Really appreciate it. Really fun and interesting discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.